A few days after my Holland America South America cruise successfully departed Buenos Aires, 150 cruisers from the United States and Canada were stunned when they were denied boarding there by Celebrity Cruises for their South America cruise. Not only did they lose the entire cost of their cruise, but they also had to scramble to find ways to get home at their own cost without any help from the line. They were all experienced cruisers, however, cruising the Caribbean and Alaska frequently. But as they discovered, as I have warned before, if you approach South America the way you do cruising in those other regions, things can unravel fast. Welcome aboard. I'm Gary Bembridge, and I've cruised South America twice, once for 14 days and most recently for 31 days. And I've spotted 7 mistakes, including the one I've just mentioned, that even experienced cruisers like you could make, so make sure you avoid making them. So why were those 150 cruisers denied boarding? They got it wrong by not staying on top of the constant changing rules and restrictions in South America. In their case, Brazil had recently introduced a rule requiring US and Canadian citizens to have a visa to enter the country. And because their cruise was going there, anyone that didn't have one was denied boarding. And as I mentioned, at their own cost. While some claimed they had called Celebrity Cruises customer service, who had said they didn't need one, that was irrelevant and disregarded by the line, because cruise line terms and conditions state very clearly it's entirely up to us passengers to make sure we have any visas required when cruising. Lines will not give any compensation nor refund fares if we are denied boarding either. In this region, as I've discovered myself, there can be sudden changes in rules and travel guidance, and you need to stay on top of it at all times. For example, 15 days into my recent cruise, due to political troubles and unrest, the UK Foreign Office advised against any travel to Manta, Ecuador region, where we were going to be docking. However, the US State Department were just advising more caution. Now, the UK government advice meant that if I got off in Manta against that no travel advice, my travel insurance could be invalidated. So I actually cancelled my excursion and I stayed on the ship. Also, between my last and latest trip, countries have clamped down on taking food off in port. In Chile, they'd even introduced an online declaration that created a QR code that I had to have on my phone to show on request in every port, and they'd added $100 plus fines for every item brought on land. Unlike my last trip, I found a strict requirement to have government-issued photo ID when getting off in port. As you won't have your passport because you hand that in so the line can do immigration checks in each country, bring a photo ID like a driver's license. This has become essential. This all shows how important it is to stay on top of, even during the cruise, any rules and guidance in this very changeable region. But let's step back now and talk more about the mistakes I see with cruise choices and in-port plans. I see many people choosing the wrong cruise for them. All cruises here are longer. The shortest is around 2 weeks, and a full South America circumnavigation can take up to 70 days. The most popular and the one I recommend for first-timers is the 2-week Santiago to Buenos Aires option that passes Cape Horn and covers the bottom half of the continent. Why do I recommend this one? Well, in that relatively short time, you can see many iconic places and sites. Gorgeous Buenos Aires, penguins in the Falklands, the beautiful national park near Ushuaia, Glacier Alley in the Chilean fjords, historic Punta Arenas. Some even include an Antarctica peninsula sail-by. You can then add pre- and post-days to see the incredible Aguza Falls or Machu Picchu. A total circumnavigation, or as I did, a 31-night partial circumnavigation, is fantastic too, as you get to see the upper half with sites like Rio, Amazon, Nazca lines, and Lima in Peru, or even like I did, you can take an off-ship excursion to Machu Picchu, or as others did, the Galapagos, and you get to transit the Panama Canal. Some other typical cruises are an east coast from Florida to Rio, or a west coast through Panama to Lima. And of course, there are expedition cruises in South America that I'm not going to talk about here, like Patagonia, Galapagos, and Antarctica. However, I have seen even when people choose the right itinerary for them, they make the mistake of not checking and digesting one big specific issue with any South America cruise: sea days. There are a lot of sea days cruising South America, as the distance covered is enormous. On my first cruise, a 14-day cruise from Santiago to Buenos Aires, we only had 7 ports in that 14 days. On my recent 31-day cruise, we only had 13 ports, though we did have an overnight in Buenos Aires and 2 in Lima. But I see many people struggle with the sea days. Why is that? Well, first of all, the seas in the lower half of South America can actually be pretty rough due to wind and swells. I saw many people weren't expecting, nor were they prepared for this. They had only expected choppy seas when passing Cape Horn, which of course is renowned for it. But on both my trips, we had bumpy seas from Buenos Aires via the Falklands to Ushuaia, and even up the coast of Chile when we were outside of the fjords. Outside decks were sometimes closed because it was too windy. Production shows were rescheduled on my first trip because of the bouncing into the sea. The pool was emptied occasionally on both trips. The second area I saw people struggle with the number of sea days was around entertainment. Many of the cruise lines sailing South America, like Holland America, I went on for both, focus very heavily on enrichment when here. And so daytime events are heavy on port talks, regional immersion talks, and regional events like local music performances, local dance classes, local cooking demonstrations, and so on. So those who weren't really into that found the many sea days became a little bit tedious, to be honest. So it is important when choosing a line to understand there's a lot of sea days, and you really need to make sure that the line is going to have a daily program of sea day activities that will keep you entertained. However, on the upside, one mistake people make about sea days is not appreciating that some of the sea days will be as fascinating as the ports themselves. For example, on both cruises, I went into the Chilean fjords to cruise Glacier Alley, a series of 5 stunning glaciers. I visited Bruggen Glacier, the biggest glacier in the southern hemisphere out of Antarctica, sailed of course around the infamous Cape Horn, and passed shipwrecks in Sacramento Channel. But when it comes to the ports themselves, I do see people make the mistake of not really understanding the nature of the ports that are called into. South America ports, unlike the Caribbean, Alaska, and many European ports, are almost all working container or fishing ports. They're not attractive, often with very little to see and do close to them. Being working ports, I found myself looking at containers, freight ships, or fishing ships being unloaded. And in most, you can't walk off the ship and you have to use a shuttle to and from the ship to a cruise terminal or the port entrance. This makes embarkation and disembarkation in places like Buenos Aires, San Antonio, and Valparaiso, the 2 ports that service Santiago, and Lima, another popular embarkation disembarkation port, are definitely more challenging because the terminals are far from the ship and you're bussed to and fro. Also, as working freight ports, they're very mixed in terms of cruise passenger facilities. While there are a couple of modern cruise terminals in some places like Buenos Aires or even Manta, Ecuador, most have temporary gazebos or small service buildings with limited facilities. Added to that, these working ports are often in areas that are not particularly safe to walk around, often with warnings to not do so from the cruise line. And certainly, unlike the Caribbean and Alaska, there's usually little or nothing of note to see within walking distance or close by the port. Most are just gateway ports to sites and attractions further inland. So if you're the sort of person like me that usually prefers self-exploring or just strolling about near the port, you are going to find many ports rather limiting. There are a couple of exceptions though. On the plus side, for example, Montevideo is very safe around the port, with a carnival museum and fantastic food market just across the road, and maybe a 15-20 minute walk into town with beautiful sights and the lovely Independence Square and museums. Port Stanley, once you've got the tender in, you can stroll around the rather quaint little town. In Ushuaia, you can also walk into the town. Punta Arenas, you can actually walk in not too far, look at the very small museums and beautiful buildings that are there. By the way, there are usually 1 or 2 tender ports too. On my latest cruise, that was in Port Stanley in the Falklands and Puerto Montt in Chile. So, tender ports are at risk due to those weather-related sea conditions I spoke about. For example, on my first trip, we were only 1 out of 7 of the Holland America cruises that season that successfully were able to tender into Port Stanley. But the limited ability to self-explore and key must-see sites not being close to ports leads me to another area I saw so many people get wrong: excursions. Because people expect to self-explore, most don't budget nor plan ahead far enough for excursions. More than any other region I've cruised in, I feel that excursions are key to getting the most out of South America. because the must-see sites are further away from the port, and relying on public transport or even taxis is often challenging or not practical. I've also found that excursions have more limited capacity because the infrastructure is still building up, and they're also very costly. In my first 2-week trip, I spent $1,200 on excursion, and I spent well over $2,000 on excursions on my most recent trip, excluding that off-ship excursion to Machu Picchu. And that was even by not doing an excursion in every port. Many excursions will cost $200 and upwards. Now, I also only used cruise line excursions. Why is that? Well, in many ports, there aren't independent tour operators dockside, which there are in many other regions, and my usual go-to third-party and cheaper independent providers like shoreexcursionsgroup.com, ventureshore.com, and viator.com actually had rather limited options and none at all in many of the ports. Now, some people I met did find some success finding local guides through toursbylocals.com. So I was more reliant on cruise line excursions than usual, but I did have that reassurance of knowing they would wait if you were delayed getting back from those further away sites. In fact, the ship on this last trip did actually wait in Salavere port in Peru for a delayed line excursion for quite a long while. I have a video dedicated to the must-see sites and excursions and their cost by ports. More on that later. But here is a quick flavor of what to expect to see cruising South America. In Port Stanley, you can see penguins. In Ushuaia, you can get the fascinating ex-convict train through the national park. In Punta Arenas, you can visit Magdalena Island to see nesting penguins. In Puerto Montt, you can go to Lake Los Todos, see the snow-capped volcanoes and the Petuhue Falls. In Coquimbo, you can visit historic lighthouses and markets. In General San Martin, you can fly over the mysterious Nazca lines. In Callao, Lima, you can even take a 2-night off-ship excursion to Machu Picchu, though that will cost at least $4,000 and upwards to do. But also make the mistake many made. You must plan and book excursions before you board. I couldn't believe how many of the ports were all or mostly sold out of excursions when I checked on embarkation day. Also, as there is often just 1 or 2 main sites at a port, they can get rather busy, especially if there are 2 or more ships in that particular day. One example, at the Petuhue Falls near Puerto Montt, there must have been at least 500 people just from my Holland America ship, all there at one time. But even after choosing the right itinerary and relevant excursions, there is something I saw so many people get wrong on both trips, affecting their enjoyment of both because they're not appreciated or checked on one key factor. And that is the impact of the weather, made worse, of course, by many people badly mispacking as a result of that. The South America cruise season mostly runs from November to March, which is the region's summer period. So most people, me included the first time, think of sun and heat. But that's not the case for much of the trip. For wild places like Buenos Aires or Santiago, where I boarded my trips, it was sunny and around 30 degrees Celsius. I guess that's 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Once down in the south, like Port Stanley, Ushuaia, Glacier Alley, Punta Arenas, it was only around 7 to 9 degrees Celsius. That's 44 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. When I look back at my photographs and videos, I have pictures of me in the south with a woolen hat, big jacket, scarf, gloves. Then as we head up the continent, that slowly strips off to a less warm jacket, and eventually I'm in short sleeve shirt, cap, sunglasses, and shorts. And it was unpredictable. With rain and sunshine all in one day, I was really glad I'd packed a good raincoat both times. So you need to be prepared that weather may mess with your time out on deck and on your excursions. For example, on my first trip to Lake Todos Los Santos, I had blue skies and beautiful views of the snow-capped volcano. This trip, it was shrouded in clouds and was totally invisible. While on my first trip, low clouds and rain made seeing the glaciers in Glacier Alley less magical and difficult, this trip was clear with beautiful skies. Another area where I saw people get things wrong out in port was around currency. And this is another example where things are changing fast in the region. When I went a couple of years ago, it was essential to have local currency to buy things in port. Vendors pay taxes and so on. So I needed currency for Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Now that's actually changed. First, there is much more use of US dollars with vendors. People linked to the tourist areas will often take US dollars, and taxis too. And many more people this time were taking cards and Apple Pay, even some of the vendors. So the first time I didn't take enough currency. This time I just took way too much local currency and came back with loads. However, there is a big watch out when it comes to using US dollars. People will not take damaged bills. The guide told me after the people will give her damaged bills as a tip. And she said people may as well give her tissue paper or Monopoly money because banks will not take damaged US dollars, so they can't change it into the local currency. I saw a stallholder turn down a sale of well over $70 because people were trying to include damaged bills as part of the payment. But overall, the key is making sure you see the right things in each port. And I actually have tips on that too. So join me over in this video that I mentioned earlier to find out what they are and why. See you over there.